How is it that we, as a society, are richer than ever but cannot afford to pay people living wages or to keep important institutions funded? This thought of mine is founded on three separate observations. First is my grandma telling how back in her days, 80 years ago, every little village had 3 banks, post office, etc. This was a time when more people owned horses than cars, and most houses didn't have electricity or running water. Second was me visiting a hotel museum and seeing what a luxury suite looked like back in the 1950s. I was astonished to see that my first student apartment looked better than what I was seeing. Sure, time had worn down some of the furniture, which were built to last, and mine were cheap crap, but still. I didn't expect that. Third happened yesterday, when I went to my local cinema, which belongs to a huge national chain, the market leader in fact, and the branch I went to is one of their tent-pole cinemas in the capital. Yet, the main ticket sales office was replaced by DIY automats, apparently to save costs. So, there is a huge contradiction in my head and in my worldview. On one hand, I've been told countless times how we are richer than ever, and I can certainly believe it. We own things and can afford things that many previous generations could barely dream of. Things that costed a fortune 50 years ago are within reach for many modern people. Robots and internet are making many formerly expensive things dirt cheap today. Unlike previous generations, like my grandma's, we don't give our pots and pans to our kids to use, they can easily buy their own many times over. Instead of pencil and paper, we use laptops to take notes on a class. On the other hand, it seems like there is no money for anything. I can barely find a movie theater or grocery store or a public transport or a fast food place that doesn't require me, as a customer, to do some free manual labor in order to purchase things. More and more people, it seems, are sacked from their jobs because companies cannot afford to keep them, and those that remain have their workloads doubled. Sure, some of the contradiction can be explained with the expansion of technology. There are no more banks because of internet banking, no more post offices because of emails. But time and time again I hear how big companies, that ought to be profitable, are publicly complaining how they can barely afford to do their basic duties. And I can see how in every way they are seeking ways to cut costs. How we can be a society that is richer than ever, yet also a barely functioning corpse, one bad year away from completely collapsing due to lack of funds. I'm a leftist, but can we really attribute all this to greedy billionaires? An early writer addressing some of these thoughts wrote a book that appeared in 1892, for example, writing about how the people of Paris could feed and support themselves on around 4 hours of work per day. The reason is ultimately socio-political. It's completely against the interests of the most powerful members of society to let us share our resources efficiently and to organize in a way which would allow technology to deliver on its ever-tantalizing promise of freeing us from daily mindless drudgery. In part, things are cheaper because of automation and outsourcing labor to countries where pay is minimal. You're describing two sides of the same coin. This. Also on automation, if wages keep rising for low-effort jobs, companies are highly incentivized to automate the process, which dries up even more jobs. There are many contributing factors, but one of the biggest is that income and wealth inequality are higher than they have ever been and are still growing source. The gap between the richest and poorest is ever widening, so even though society as a whole makes or produces more overall, the vast majority of that growth does into the pockets of the very few, which may be an essential feature of capitalism. Furthermore, the political system and means of production are skewed towards benefiting these very few as they grow in power. Lastly, I think this is a claim that we have to analyze and be healthily skeptical about. Are things really as bad as we think? Or are people healthier and better off overall than they have ever been in the history of humankind? It might be both, but it's all relative. The wealth is disproportionately distributed to the wealthiest people, and the distribution is trending in the direction of increasingly disproportionate distribution. You mean in America? Are you aware of the corporate process? A business decides it wants to go public with an IPO. It decides to create a bunch of shares, and it goes to investors/Wall Street to try and sell these initial shares. The investors buy the shares and give the company their money in exchange for the shares. The company takes the investor money and sends that money overseas to have their product produced for cheap. So already that is American money being sent to other countries where it enriches foreign economies. The company receives the product from the foreign factories, and it sells the product here in America for a profit to generate profit for the company. To generate more profit, the company finds ways to pay American employees less and to reduce the number of American employees because employees are expensive. The money is funneled up the chain mostly to CEOs and back to Wall Street. It is spent on employee labor/benefits, production cost, invested back into the company for expansion, paying debt, sits in offshore accounts and in shell companies to avoid taxation, things like that. When they say the economy is great, they are mostly talking about the stock market. Most of the benefit of the stock market goes to people/organizations that hold a lot of stock, aka the wealthy. And yeah, the wealthy are doing great right now. Basically, money is sent overseas and goes to the wealthy, while the rest of us move closer to a third-world country quality of life. Unions used to be more common and gave employees leverage against the company. They gave employees a way to organize and fight together for policies that would benefit the employees. A single employee arguing against an organized business doesn't have much leverage, but an organized group of employees does. I think a really important part of the equation is where all the money is. Overall, as a society, we are richer, but a small amount of people are really bringing up that average. The rich are richer than they used to be. Cutting costs is still something companies do when they're making money. And automation isn't only something you do to cut costs. It makes business faster and more effective when done right. A movie ticket vending machine, for example, is cheaper and doesn't make mistakes as often as a human does. It shows you an intuitive menu that gives you more functionality and moves the line faster. Sure, you're doing a free manual labor in the form of pressing a button, but every button press is replacing a verbal cue you would otherwise have given to a human operator in the old days. Pressing the button for the movie you want and the time you want to see it at is not more work than walking up to a human and saying, "I'd like to see this movie at that time." Plus, it's actually less work for hearing impaired customers and those who have thick accents or don't speak the local language. Instead of having to repeat themselves and struggle to clarify things, pressing a button is pretty much universal. I think your idea of what you should be able to buy is a little skewed. Being able to afford necessities and then complaining about the cost of luxuries that in your estimation should be almost free isn't an historically accurate perspective. It's this entitlement to things that skews your perspective. I'm not being rude or even saying that you believe this to be 100% true, it's just that we as a generation are being told we should have everything for almost nothing, and if it costs us anything we complain without having said historical perspective, generalizing, but I'm making a larger point. If we're talking historical perspective, wages have stagnated for most Americans. Counterbalancing this is cheaper consumer goods, such as iPhones, cars, clothes, food, etc. At the same time, however, essential services for mobility and quality of life have gotten much more expensive continuously over time. Healthcare, education, childcare, etc. This is why people feel squeezed, because they are. On net, the purchasing power of an average American has been facing constant downward pressure for several decades. There's a whole lot of corruption involved in making it so. There are those big, greedy billionaires the left likes to shit on, but they're only able to get where they are because there are very bribable politicians or aspiring politicians who are willing and able to overstep the government's boundaries and pass laws that help certain billionaires while hurting everyone else. And it's not something that the left has remotely clean hands on. They just work for different billionaires than the right. I know libertarian free market ideals get shit on a lot outside of the libertarian communities. I'll refrain from using the term capitalism. The left and the right have both poisoned that term so far from what I would actually mean by using it, and I'm hardly a zealot for it in the first place. But I do think there's a lot of truth to the notion that government interference in the free market causes a lot of unforeseen and unintended effects. I don't share the libertarian ideal that we can just deregulate and privatize everything and wind up in an immediate libertarian utopia, but I think they have certainly addressed a key component of the cause when they bother to actually stop and think about it instead of just deciding to punch down at the same people conservatives love to punch down at. The government stepped in some cases out of a popular demand to try and fix a problem, in other cases out of a backroom deal between private sector and public sector powers or a quid pro quo for some campaign donations, and changed laws and regulations so that they would benefit the hyper-rich while making things worse for everyone else. I mean, if you wanted to live, like your grandparents grew up, in a house with no electricity/water and subsist primarily on homegrown veggies, and wear the same clothes every day, then you could probably save up a ton of money.